This video was brought to you by Nebula. When Netanyahu was sworn in as Israel's Prime Minister for the sixth time last December, no one expected it to be smooth sailing. His cabinet contained a host of unpopular right-wing firebrands, and his legislative agenda included a hyper-controversial bill giving Netanyahu almost complete control over Israel's judiciary and Supreme Court. In fact, in just the last couple of days, millions of Israelis have taken to the streets to protest the bill. And tensions between protesters and the government escalated yet again on Sunday night, when Netanyahu fired his defense minister for suggesting that Netanyahu should shelve the reforms. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the bill itself, why it sparked such massive protests, and whether this might finally be the end for Netanyahu. So before we get into the massive protests, a bit of context. Basically, since 2019, Israel struggled to form a stable government because most mainstream parties have refused to work with Benjamin Netanyahu, who is currently on trial for charges of corruption and bribery. Despite his legal problems though, a plurality of between 25 and 30% of Israelis still supported Netanyahu's Likud party. And this made forming a coalition without them very difficult. In fact, Israel suffered through 4 elections in 2 years trying to sort out this mess, until the opposition parties finally agreed to a diverse coalition government composed of 8 parties, including the right-wing Israeli Nationalist Party and the Arab Islamic Party. Inevitably, however, this coalition collapsed, leading to yet more elections at the end of last year. Again though, Likud won about 25% of the vote. But this time, Netanyahu decided that he was able to form a government by allying with a whole load of right-wing Israeli nationalist parties. In the past, Netanyahu avoided forming coalitions with the far right, but he apparently realized that this was essentially his only route back to power, so it's what he decided to do. Now, Netanyahu's new government was controversial for a whole load of reasons. His cabinet has included some pretty unpalatable characters, including the police minister, who's been indicted 53 times and previously convicted of incitement to racism. Netanyahu's legislative agenda is also pretty spicy, especially his judicial reforms. That's because Netanyahu doesn't like Israel's Supreme Court, because he thinks they just get too involved. That's because the Supreme Court used the fact that Israel doesn't have a codified constitution to overrule certain laws passed by the Knesset. And just generally, the Supreme Court are more secular and left-wing than Netanyahu would really like. As such, the proposed judicial reform, which has been the focus of all of the recent protests, would neuter the Supreme Court by giving the Israeli government almost total control over the judiciary via 3 major changes. Firstly, it will give the Israeli government more power to appoint judges, who are currently appointed by a panel composed of other Supreme Court judges and lawyers from the like-minded Israeli Bar Association. Secondly, it would reduce the court's ability to curtail or dismiss certain laws which relate to stuff like national security. And thirdly, it would introduce a so-called override clause, requiring a simple majority of 61 MPs. Now, in practice, because the government usually controls a majority in the parliament, this would give the government the power to ignore any Supreme Court rulings that they didn't like. Now, many Israelis don't like these changes for at least 4 reasons. The first and most obvious is that the law would remove the separation of power between the judiciary and the parliament, which defines almost all liberal democracies. Secondly, whatever the bill's real merits, it just looks like a sneaky way for Netanyahu to get out of his legal troubles. For those of you who don't know, Netanyahu is currently on trial for charges of corruption and bribery. And according to reports, any plea deal is likely to require Netanyahu to plead guilty to moral turpitude, which carries a 7-year ban on elected office. So this reform looks like a sneaky way for Netanyahu to just cling on to power. Thirdly, even if you think the relationship between the parliament and the courts needs reform, Many people think that this ought to be done via cross-party consensus, which is what the country's former prime minister has even suggested. Fourthly, many industries worry that this reform will be bad for Israel's economy, which relies on its relatively stable political institutions and its appeal to liberal-leaning tech workers. Anyway, this is why, for the last few weeks, there have been unprecedented protests across Israel, especially in urban areas. Early this month, hundreds of thousands of Israelis marched through Tel Aviv to protest the new law, in what one newspaper described as the largest demonstration in the country's history. And these protests aren't just big, they've also united Israel's usually pretty divided opposition, bringing together tech workers, university students, lawyers, LGBTQ+ organizations, center-left Zionist parties, Arab groups, and even former IDF officers. Anyway, these protests reached a new climax on Sunday evening after Netanyahu fired his defense minister, a fellow member of Netanyahu's Likud party, for breaking ranks and urging Netanyahu to drop the new law. And following his dismissal, hundreds of thousands of protesters took to the streets in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, where they clashed with the police outside of Netanyahu's home and the Israeli parliament. And by the early hours of Monday, even Israel's president urged Netanyahu to stop the reforms and put Israel's citizens above all else. At the same time, Israel's labor unions announced a general strike, bringing the entire country to a standstill. On top of this, the Israeli opposition tabled a no-confidence vote, which Netanyahu only narrowly survived, and only because his coalition desperately didn't want to go to another election. Regardless though, following the no-confidence vote, and with public pressure mounting, Netanyahu's Likud party briefed the media that they would pause their legislative reforms until at least late April. However, no formal announcement of this ever came out, only a vague tweet asking protesters to behave responsibly. And since then, there have even been reports that far-right ministers in Netanyahu's coalition are threatening to resign if Netanyahu drops the reforms, leaving Netanyahu in an impossible dilemma. If he ditches the reforms, he looks weak and will likely lose his majority in parliament, which would lead to fresh elections, which Netanyahu would almost definitely lose by a landslide. But on the other hand, if he pushes forward with it, he'll cause further chaos and risk breaking Israel's entire political system. Even then, there's a good chance that he doesn't get it through anyway, given that a non-trivial number of Likud MPs have now told him that he ought to pause it. All in all, it really looks like this could be the end for Netanyahu. Even if he does somehow cling on to power, it's hard to see him surviving until the next elections. As a final thing, in some sense, this was sort of inevitable. Netanyahu's coalition was always too right-wing for ordinary Israelis, especially given Israel's political diversity. Polling from as early as December, before Netanyahu was even sworn in, found that just 21% of Israelis approved his new government, compared to 55% who disapproved. And all of his key policies were deeply unpopular. And while Netanyahu promised the media that he'd be able to control his more right-wing partners, this was always implausible, given the personalities involved and the simple fact that Netanyahu was directly relying on them for his majority, giving them enormous leverage. We'll have to wait and see how much longer Netanyahu manages to hang on for then, but he doesn't look like he has a particularly strong hand. If that's not enough TLDR for you for one day, then you ought to check out our new series, This Week in Parliament, which has just made a magnificent return. That's not a quote or anything, that's just a thing I'm saying. Anyway, This Week in Parliament is a show where we run down exactly what happened in Parliament in the preceding week, breaking down the debates, laws and bills which otherwise you'd have totally missed, and explaining what really happens in Britain's seats of power when you brush aside all of the shouting and arm waving. New episodes of that come out every week, only on Nebula. But that's not all. There's also the extended version of the daily briefing every single weekday, a bunch of exclusive explainer videos, some totally silly fun content, and all of our videos totally ad-free. And it's not just TLDR either. We're joined by a whole bunch of your favorite creators, from Wendover and Real Life Law to Johnny Harris, which means that on Nebula, there's a whole ton of exclusive videos, early access to loads of creators, and all of the ad-free viewing you could possibly handle. And signing up using our link gets you access for just $2.50 a month. Not only that, this is the absolute best way you can support the channel. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon on Nebula.